Rungu, where is the disconnect? Are you seeing a disconnect here when it comes to healthcare provision? Because one, it is devolved, but at the same time, deals are being struck with the national government and not with the county government. Where is the disconnect here?
Well, let me just start by saying, we closed the year with the good news that both the doctors' union and the clinical workers had reached agreement to call off strikes. And I think that was a moment that all of us welcomed. It is sad that really the agreement with the clinical workers has unraveled. And I think the lesson is very clear that in our current constitutional and political context, you cannot have an agreement simply with the national government, between the national government and healthcare providers. There has to be a tripartite relationship, and therefore the Council of Governors needed to be involved in that process. And again, we face the prospects of another long period of strike unless this can be resolved. But I think the key thing for me really here is to go back to the doctors' union's demand for a health service or a health service commission in the format of the service commission. What they have been seeing for many months, if not years now, that actually how you keep the health workers at their posts, how you keep them properly remunerated and protected, particularly during this period of COVID, is essentially to have a single central mechanism that allows for this to happen and is a point of focus for not just the counties, the national government and the healthcare workers. So I think that for me is what is brought back into focus by this unraveling of this agreement that had been reached that is no longer now in place. And I think the second point, really, I wanted to come back to Kelvin Mungai's comment about how we normalize problems, how we cannot expect anything different from either this country or from this government or this particular administration. And I think I would just really caution him on that kind of thinking, because one thing that I've learned from 2020 essentially is that problem-centered thinking ultimately affects my own well-being. It ultimately affects my capacity to make a change, to make a difference in this country. And I speak here really as the Executive Director of Amnesty International, where every day we receive complaints from the public, we receive concerns and cases of injustice by Kenyans and by refugees. And one of the things I've learned is that if I continue to just see this as an ever-ending problem, then my personal well-being and mental health will probably suffer as a result. So I continue to look for proactive, progressive ways of dealing with these issues. And obviously, many of these issues are systemic, so it means they will be with us for a long time until we have systemic responses to them. They're not really case-by-case responses. So I would really urge you, Kelvin, if you're still listening, to really cultivate this thinking alongside the rest of the country, so that we actually can come at these problems with a degree of decisiveness, a degree of compliance and accountability, and that it ensures that we are not at the prey of essentially what I would call fatalistic thinking, or thinking that does not expect any difference. That's what the system wants us to do. It wants us to give up and to essentially wallow in problems so that we're not able to provide solutions and demand accountability based on those solutions.
All right. And Mark, there's another concern here from Baba Josephine. He calls himself Mburu Mose. He says it's very unfortunate that Mark Bichachi thinks that healthcare concerns should be localized to specific counties. Healthcare should be a national priority. The opinion that healthcare workers should initiate a constitutional change to revert to national government is backward.
You know, that statement is sad, really, because health is a devolved function. Whether we like it or not, it's a devolved function. If you're going to call a national strike to deal with a devolved function, then you are going against the Constitution. Now, that's not a Mark Bichachi opinion, that's a statement of fact. If he wakes up tomorrow and he doesn't like the sky being blue, I can't help him. But if we are going to solve problems in this country, health is a devolved function. At the end of the day, it is a governor to sign off on the paychecks of these doctors. So at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, that is how it has to be. And how has it been implemented? If you look at how even COVID has been affected, if you look at how many beds are prepared for COVID across the country, you realize it depends on the governor. The governors who hired beds, the governors who bought beds, the governors who hired more health workers, the governors who didn't. So at the end of the day, he may be sad at what I'm telling him, but my objective here and my job here is to tell him the plain truth, that it is a devolved function. If we want to nationalize it, it requires a referendum. Or what other option could I possibly give?
All right. Now let's talk about something else here before we move on. I want to see and get a few comments on this issue of healthcare. Kelvin Mugai says, what we are getting wrong in this country is that the government does not realize that health is a critical department. No politics should be here at all. GOK should emulate other countries like Scotland on this issue around health. So let's talk about this. Amidst all this, there's now another push for the BBI. And Daisy, I'll start with you on this issue. We've seen a lot of back and forth on this one as well. Now there's a letter coming from Irungu Kangata saying that the Mount Kenya region does not support the BBI. But, and yet, at this particular point, the country is still facing many things. Should we even be talking about such a referendum at this point?
Well, you know, Trevor, my opinion is in the public domain. It is not a priority. You know, Kenya is facing so many there are many crises that we are facing. We have talked about some of them here, the health crisis, the education crisis. The other thing we're not talking about is we have a debt crisis. The government is not able to pay civil servants. We closed the year with the government saying that there would be a delay in the pay of salaries to civil servants. The cabinet secretary for Treasury, Ukur Yatani, is proposing to go to Parliament to seek to extend the debt ceiling from 9 trillion to 12 trillion. How can BBI, how can amending or overhauling the Constitution be a priority? Who has asked for this? You know, it is the politicians that have driven this agenda. This, much as they are calling it a popular initiative, BBI has not been driven by the people. The people are not the ones who are saying these are our priorities. The people are crying out. They are saying our priorities are education, our priorities are health, our priorities are employment, our priorities are economic recovery. It is so irresponsible for the government to imagine that they are going to drive us a year before a general election, which is a constitutional requirement. Because you see, a referendum is not a priority because it's not a constitutional requirement. This is just being driven by political desires to create positions for themselves. However, an election is a constitutional requirement. We are just, 1.5 years a bit, to a general election. So this is essentially a pre-election year. And the government, instead of addressing the challenges that are facing the people, feel that the priority should be to run us into a political contest. I think it's extremely irresponsible. And I don't think that it is, aside from lacking wisdom, the reality is that Kenya, the environment that they are trying to push this agenda is not optimum, and it could end up very badly.
All right. Kimeo, the people you are speaking to, did any of them mention constitutional amendment as a priority?
Not indeed, Trevor. I think the only comment that was made that could be said to be an invitation to speak about constitutional amendments was on the question of whether health should be a devolved function or not. And that came out as a theme. So perhaps at some point we might want to have a conversation around that. And I made my views known that I think proper management of the health function must remain with the counties, and that the national government should really give the space to the counties and support the counties to discharge this function. Other than that, there was absolutely nothing else. As a matter of fact, Trevor, the issues that came out prominently were about the need to pay closer attention to the management of resources, public resources generally, but also for the health sector. The issue of economic hardships that I just mentioned, and which, of course, Daisy in our statement alludes to it, because the debt question that we are dealing with now impacts negatively on our ability to address existing and emerging challenges. That we do not have the spending headspace to address emerging issues quite robustly. And then the question of disaster and emergency planning for future pandemic also came up as a major lesson and recommendation. And then at a more personal level, for individual level, the question of personal savings and investments. And then, of course, at the national level, poor leadership and lack of good governance, including corruption, was a major theme that was running through. And Trevor, if I may just conclude by saying that, when I look at the BBI and the issues that the BBI proposes to address are important issues. I do, however, see a disconnect between the way in which we propose to address these issues and the reality itself. And some of these do not actually require, most of them do not require constitutional amendments. Take, for example, the question of debt acquisition and retirement, which is an issue that a number of Kenyans have been raising for some time. We are where we are because the executive failed and Parliament failed, because Parliament approves all these expenditures. And with the kind of politics we are playing, it's very easy to see us raising the debt ceiling even beyond the 12, 15 trillion, or whatever number. I think we must reflect very soberly as Kenyans and see whether we would want to accept this kind of thing to define our future, because the future of our children is already undermined and in jeopardy when resources are borrowed and not utilized with probity in a manner that would spur economic development. And then you are saddled with debts that have to be paid over a long period of time against a reality of an economy that has been struggling.
Yeah. Mark, are we overreacting here when it comes to the BBI? Is it necessary at this point?
You know, one of the things that I would really like to broadly situate for Kenyans is that, number one, referenda are not innately evil. And the idea that BBI is somehow the reason why we don't have desks and classrooms is not, those two things are not equal. You know, it's like saying we can't chew gum, walk and talk in the same time in this country. BBI has not diverted any of the funds that were given to the fight against COVID, any of the funds that were given towards healthcare, that were given towards education. But these are popular political sentiments that anyone who doesn't understand budgeting and how countries work would think that there is an argument there, but really it's just complete hot air. But secondly, there is something to be said about the state of our economy every time we go around an election. There is something to be said that we lose 3 GDP points on average every time we go to an election in this country. 3 GDP points is roughly the same economic damage that we've done to this economy thanks to COVID, okay? So in my view, number one, economically speaking, solving the issues of tensions around our elections is as economically important as the economic recovery strategy that already exists, because the Minister of Trade, Minister of Finance, every cabinet itself has had various stakeholder meetings. There are many plans in place, in play, in terms of recovering the economy. It is not related to BBI. I doubt whether Betty Maina is losing any sleep about BBI, and I know she's working very hard, for example, to ensure that the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which Kenya entered into and 33 African countries have already agreed to, is in play. And those are some of the things that we refuse to discuss as a people, then decide in our own imagination that the government is doing nothing in terms of economic recovery. But on the other side of the coin, the BBI is not just a question of referendum. And we need to understand one of the pillars of the BBI is social engineering. There's a pillar called Utu. There's a pillar about revamping and re-executing Chapter 6 of the Constitution. Why do I bring this up? We cannot in one sentence say that we need to address how leadership is done in this country and then choose the side that once a governor has been impeached for gross misconduct and generally just being a horrible human being, then choose to side with the side that is siding with such an individual. These are some of the issues that we as a country need to be serious about. And number two, branding a referendum as an evil project from the get-go is to assume that the Kenyan voter does not have an option in the matter. The BBI will be, the BBI referendum, not all of it, will be a question where the Kenyan people will choose. Any exercise in choice is in the right direction because the BBI is not just supposed to be a bill that passes, it's supposed to be a conversation that we're having as a country.
Yeah.
And if you look at the number of referenda that have been held in 2020 across the world, if you look at the number of elections that have been held, you cannot then say that the execution of a democratic right given to us by the Constitution is a good idea. And I understand that in Kenya civil society, and they are my friends, has this idea that if they do something, then they're doing the right thing, and if government does it, it's doing the wrong thing. But really, let's look at it objectively. Okay. There was 2 years of conversation about the BBI. There is a section of politicians who decided no from the beginning, didn't participate in it, and now criticizing it. The same is true for civil society. Conversations in society are a continuous process. Okay. And just the same way Ekuru Aukot sat somewhere by himself and came up with a constitutional referendum which was praised by the same people who are fighting BBI, there is no other reason to say that BBI, because it is an idea that that came from a quarter you don't like, that now it's a bad idea. And then you say because of BBI, now we're not building roads. Surely, now we're not. These things are totally disconnected. Or do you think Magoha was in the BBI task force writing that report? And these are the kind of political shenanigans we need to stop. Let's tell Kenyans the truth. If you don't like the Utu clause in the BBI, say it. But let's not bring and say, oh, my goodness, we are not recovering because of BBI.
Okay. Irungu, are we being objective when it comes to the BBI?
So I think Kenyans need to be careful. There are a number of issues that have got collapsed, and I'd like to just uncollapse them. Let me uncollapse two of them. The first is that BBI is a referendum. No, the BBI project is essentially, as Sam has talked about, it is a set of administrative, legal, and constitutional changes that are being proposed. And I think it is not possible, if I can uncollapse the second thing, to put them all into one basket. I mean, they are essentially a range of recommendations, some of which are critical and important for this country, and some of which, are not, plainly speaking. And I think it's Kenyans who have to make the decision once these proposals are put before them, whether they will back them or not. And therefore, I think collapsing BBI in a referendum is not helpful. And this part I do agree with Mark. I think Mark needs to perhaps revisit the statement of the Electoral Commission on October the 29th, where they had a bit of an exchange between themselves and Raila Odinga. Raila Odinga seems to suggest that, in his professional opinion, that it would cost 2 billion shillings for a referendum. The Electoral Commission did a calculation, and I'll just go through this because I think it's important that Kenyans remember this, where they came up with a figure of 14 billion shillings or 13.7 billion shillings for the cost of a referendum. And how is this calculated? It's calculated on the basis of registered voters. In 2010, when we passed the constitution, we had 12.6 million Kenyans. We had 27,000 polling stations, and the cost of that referendum was 10 billion shillings, and the cost was essentially 794 shillings per voter. They then calculated on the basis of roughly about 19.6 voters in 2021 and 40,000 or so polling stations, that it would cost us 13.7 billion shillings, and that would be slightly cheaper than the referendum that took place in 2010. I've done this with a bit of detail because I think it is disingenuous to argue that a referendum will not take money away from other priorities. Now, I cannot stop the political class personally from discussing BBI. I can hear the urgency around a political arrangement that does not lead us to crisis every time of elections. I have my personal concerns that actually it is not necessarily the number of seats that are required, but a change of behavior in the political elite that will transform the zero-sum politics. So it is not that we need more seats, but it is that we need a understanding that, like football, like running, like marathons, there are losers and there are winners, and that is the nature of the game of politics also. But again, it is, we live in a country where there is freedom of expression, so I expect that my leaders and my representatives will speak. But I would really urge my member of parliament, my senator, my future governor, hopefully, to focus not so much on this issue, but really focus on the COVID-19 response, the need for a vaccine that is a people's vaccine. We know already that something like 14% of the world is now in control of 53% of all the vaccines that will be available to treat people globally. We know that India has now vetoed any export of the vaccine, which will affect Kenya's access as one of the major manufacturers in the world. These are the concerns that I think the elected representatives need to be focusing on. I think they need to also think about the issue of safety and ethics. There are people who are arguing that the vaccine essentially has within it the capacity to turn genes into the Antichrist. I think this disinformation needs to be challenged ultimately, because we know that there will be deaths that will happen if people are denied the vaccine or if they fail to take the vaccine. We saw this in South Africa. 300,000 people died because antiretroviral viral medicine was not provided to people with AIDS. These are the issues that elected representatives need to be focusing on. They need to be going to our schools this week and next week to see what the conditions are, and they need to be speaking. They don't have a gag order. They can't be gagged by the Ministry of Education or be subjected to a access permit. They need to be visiting our hospitals. We really need to find the concerns of our constituents time, and that's what I on elected representatives at this point. And I think, as non-governmental organizations, as civic organizations, that is our role also. And just coming back to Mark's point, I think our role is essentially to say, no, we know from the Electoral Commission, and we only have one Electoral Commission in this country, that this will cost somewhere upwards of 13 billion shillings. Yeah. Let's debate that also. It is a public interest issue.
All right. Daisy, I'd like to hear your views on this, whether we're being objective, because Mark said that the fact that the BBI is being brought in doesn't mean that anything else should stop.
I think that it's unfortunate that there are those who hold these views. The BBI, I say once again, is not a priority. And regardless of those people who may argue that the resources are available for that, I think that we have more urgent and more pressing needs that need resources. I think that we are being very objective. This is a low blow, as usual, to the civil society. Remember that it is same administration that coined the phrase evil society. And so this effort of trying to demonize dissenting voices that are calling for sobriety and are calling for the leadership to focus on the issues that are pressing Kenyans, because it is Kenyans that you are expecting to vote at this referendum. The other thing, when we talk about electoral justice and issues around electoral violence, I am yet to see any clause within that BBI that specifically addresses itself to that. You cannot tell us that by adding or expanding the executive to accommodate a few people from certain tribes, leaders of certain tribes, that we are going to stop electoral injustice. The problem in Kenya, and I think Kimeu and Irungu have mentioned it, is an attitude change. The problem we have is impunity and lawlessness within the political class. The BBI does not address itself to this. The problem in Kenya is not the need for more laws. We actually don't need more laws. While it is true that the Constitution may not be a perfect document, while it is true that there are issues that need to be addressed, Kimeu has said it. Many of the proposals can actually be addressed legislatively and administratively. The most pressing issue right now, we need a debt management plan, because we are spiraling a debt management plan and a spending plan. Parliament needs to begin to rein in the executive on expenditure on non-priority issues. And among the non-priority projects that Parliament needs to rein the executive on is BBI. We need to begin to channel our resources to addressing the problem that Kenyans are facing. We are not, this country is not at a good place on many fronts, whether it is economic, health-wise, socially, we are not at a good place. So it is irresponsible for anybody to suggest that running a plebiscite at this point in time in Kenya is a priority. A plebiscite, the referendum campaigns are akin to an electoral campaign. We will go, we are being pushed into a political type campaign in the midst of multiple crises, and a year before we go into a full-on general election. How responsible is that? And for Mark to suggest that it is a lack of understanding of budgets, really, Mark? When the government is scrambling helter-skelter, looking for money to pay off debt, to pay salaries, you're saying that we can afford going to spend 14 billion shillings? I think that is what is dishonest, and I think that is problematic. It must not be seen that when we criticize government, we criticize just for the sake of criticizing. Government needs to be told when it is going astray. Government needs to be told when it is taking people in the wrong direction. And right now, the government is not focusing itself on the urgent needs. They are there not for themselves, they are there for the people. So they cannot push an agenda that is not being called for the people and say it's a people's process. You're not going to make it a people's process by saying it is a people's process. This is purely a political process and for specific individuals. And right now, it's not a priority, not for majority of Kenyans. And you have seen the hostility with which it is being met.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, remember that Kenyans are passive aggressive. We may be leading ourselves into a conflict situation. And I think that that's what we should be more wary about.
Okay. Mark, quick rejoinder before I take a break.
Two things that I would like to remind Daisy Amdanyi is that, number one, the BBI constitutional referendum does actually have statements on post-election, on electoral violence and electoral malpractice. I would invite her to acquaint herself with that. Number two, when I tell her that she does not seem to understand how budgeting works, is I want to put it to her that, number one, BBI has not affected any of the budgets, whether it is for loan repayment, whether it is for healthcare or for education. There is nothing that has been touched by the BBI. That said, the economic problems that Kenya has are the economic problems of the world. They are not brought on by BBI. They will not be stopped by not having BBI, and they will not be increased by having BBI. I beg her to show me different based on actual calculations, and not the feeling that the Prime Minister position is being made for Uhuru and the presidency for Raila, and she finds that offensive. offensive in some way. And I restate that, number one, anyone who thinks that the economy is going to tank because we are discussing BBI at the same time as CS Betty is discussing economic recovery and at the same time as CS Kagwe is discussing health is misinformed about how government works. Now that she can't be offended by that, but that's just the fact.
All right. We have to take a quick break here on Daybreak. When we come back, we talk about the priorities to wind up. I see a lot of feedback here as well. We'll be back in just a bit.